So we are live. Good evening, everybody. We'll just wait for 5 minutes so that everybody joins. The link is being shared.
So I don't get to see whether people have joined or not, isn't it? Sorry.
Yeah, unfortunately not.
No. So why do you use this platform and not, say, something like Zoom or Google Meet?
It is a bit convenient for us
More
to
more
live stream
convenient.
on because they have the Facebook option.
Okay.
So I'll start.
Hmm.
Good evening, everybody. We are so very glad to have Professor Tanweer Fazal here with us today to talk on his book, Practices of the State, Muslim Law and Violence in India. So, Professor Tanweer Fazal is a professor of sociology in the University of Hyderabad, as would be indicative through the topics he's going to talk with us about today. He specializes in the sociology of nationalisms, community formation, and identifications, with specific focus on their implications on discourses of rights and entitlements. Professor Fazal has taught in the Center for Study of Social Systems in Jawaharlal University, also in the Nelson Mandela Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution at Jamia Millia University, also in the Department of Sociology. He has a number of publications, including Nation State and Minority Rights in India, Minority Nationalisms in South Asia, most recently, Practices of the State, Muslim Law and Violence in India. And in the last couple of months, he also co edited a book called Marginalities and Mobilities, which was out by Routledge. So this book, we chose this because it talks about some very pertinent topics which are today here in India. The question of Muslims, the question of the place of a Muslim in an India, and the question of the monochromatic or pluralistic nation we live in and how it's changing. Professor Fazal is going to give us this space and so that we can have this enlightened discussion. So without further ado, I shall hand it over to Professor Fazal. Please take it away.
Well, uh, hopefully I am audible to people. Uh, Arko, am I audible? Hello. Can you hear me? Hello, Arko.
Yes, sir, you're audible. You're audible.
Okay, great. Well, uh, thank you, Arco and the Voyages group, for having me over. It is interesting to know that young people today are interested in understanding some of the pressing problems of our times, intellectually as well. Uh, this book, which we are talking about, Practices of the State, Muslims, Law and Violence in India. Let me show you its, you know, I don't know whether it is visible properly or not. I don't think so, isn't it? No. Anyways, so leave that out. Yeah. So this book came out very recently, and if you have your hands on the book, you'll see that it contains 5 different chapters, besides introduction, which binds all these the three 5 different chapters. Now, each chapter addresses a distinct problem. So, it is not a sort of a book which looks into the historicity of a singularity of a problem and understand goes into various dimensions, but how the book is conceptualized or conceived is in the sense that it tries to understand the experiences of Muslim, quote unquote. As a sociologist, let me also give you a disclaimer that I do not subscribe to the view that Muslims constitute a singular or a homogeneous community. In fact, in the book, I argue that it is a collective of communities. So, very often in our media discourses, or sometimes even in academia, we refer to Muslims as a community. As a sociologist, I would have empirically drawn as well as theoretically supported reasons to argue, to contest that Muslims are a singular community in India. They constitute part of various different communities spread across the length and breadth of India. So I would not, for example, subscribe to the view that the Muslim of, say, Bengal would be similar in terms of cultural practices, in terms of customs, in terms of broader outlook, in terms of even his or her experiences of religion, similar to that, say, for example, a Muslim in Tamil Nadu, a Tamil speaking Muslim. So there are huge diversities within the community. However, for analytical sense, I refer to Muslim because, as you see, I will argue in this book as well, that while Muslims do not necessarily internally they are diverse, that they are a collective of communities, but at the same time, this idea of the Muslim being a singular identity is more externally produced. It is externally produced at the cross section of its interaction with the state on the one hand and the national public on the other hand. By national public, I mean to say the quote unquote the nation which constitutes this state. The national public is the dominant public, and its cultural characteristics are drawn largely from the dominant community. So the idea of a singular Muslim identity emerges at this cross section. It has its implications as well. It is not simply a you know some abstract intellectual category, but the idea of a Muslim being either singular as externally produced or internally diverse have had empirical implications, implications in terms of even policy discourses, as well as the way in which histories have been understood. So this book actually touches different dimensions of Muslims. You may say types and types of Muslims. So a chapter, say for example, called Bangladeshi as a metaphor. Now, Bangladeshi as a metaphor is specifically addresses the problem of Bengali Muslims, largely in the context of the CAA and the NRC in Assam, and the way in which the whole typology, the construct of a foreigner emerges. The chapter examines the history, the social and the political processes, as well as events such as Nelly massacre, to argue that how Bangladeshi as a construct or a Mia Muslim as a construct emerged and continues to have continues to inform the state discourses vis-a-vis the Muslims of Bengali origin in Assam. And it is not restricted to Assam alone, but could be extended to other parts of India. Remember, it was in Rajasthan that our current Home Minister declared that they were termites. So it has implications in other places too. The second chapter is about the politics of the sacred cow. Uh, it is titled State Practices, Hyperlegality, and Politics of the Sacred Cow. What does as you would guess easily, it actually addresses the entire question of associated with the idea of beef, the idea of beef eating, as well as cow slaughter. In India, we have in different states different kinds of laws which prohibit the slaughter of milch animals. However, with the coming of the present government, the current regime, these laws were given extra teeth. While earlier laws made certain exceptions regarding, say, buffaloes or regarding, you know, uh, non-yielding cattle, uh, those who were overaged, etc. It severely impacted, say, the livelihoods of different Muslim communities who relied on the beef as not only as a source of consumption, but also as a source of livelihood. But it is not. It does not affect the Muslims alone, although they might be mostly, in most numbers, associated with occupations related to, say, leather work, related to meat trade, as well as slaughter. But but the cow has its own, sociology as well, a political economy associated with it, and in which various different communities form a sort of a chain. Uh, so you have, say, for example, in in UP, so you have Khatiks who are Hindus, but they are also involved in leather work as well as in meat trade. There are Kasais or Kasabs who are Muslims and doing similar things. There are farmers who are both Hindus and Muslims, but mostly Hindus, who rear cows and who are involved in milk trade. But at the same time, those overage cows are dispensed with, which ultimately end up with the Kasabs or the Kasais or the Khatiks for slaughter. Uh, there are also communities such as the Dalits who are involved in, uh, skinning of animals, in leather work, and things like those. Now the question is, and which this chapter actually addresses, is how law over the years have made different kinds of shifts and come to a certain kind of a uh, and it tries to unravel the politics behind it. The third chapter in this book is about, you know an incidence of violence in your neighboring state Bihar. This incidence of violence took place in 1989. In certain sense, uh, this changed the course of politics in Bihar. It marked the end of the Congress regime, and since then it has not been able to return to power. It also, in terms of its scale, was one of the biggest interreligious case of interreligious violence. In fact, if I borrow Paul Brass's terminology or, or categorization, I would refer to it as a sort of a pogrom targeting the Muslims of Bhagalpur. The violence went on for 2 months or so. What started in the town of Bhagalpur entered its villages and it became completely intractable. There are reports which argue that how the police and the state functionaries were actively involved in the violence. Until that, we have hardly had any, you know, significant uh, punitive action. This chapter actually studies the Commission of Inquiry report. It studies Bhagalpur Riots Inquiry Commission report, which in certain ways was unique. It was unique in the sense that while we have there are various incidents of violence after which inquiry commissions are instituted, and these inquiry commissions have come out with their reports. Sometimes same incidents of violence such as Gujarat violence of 2002 has been studied by different inquiry commissions, and they have come up with different kinds of reports or findings. But the Bhagalpur Riots Inquiry Commission was unique in the sense that the same commission produced two different reports. One was the chairman's report and other were the members' reports. And these two reports contradicted each other entirely. So one found the police actively complicit in the violence targeting the minorities of Bhagalpur. The other one, in complete contrast, condoned the action of the police and held, in fact, those who were the victims of violence responsible for what they had to suffer. So, in this chapter, I look into the whole process of the production of truth, how official truths are produced, how is impunity. It is interesting if you see that most cases of mass violence in India, it is not only in the case of those targeting Muslims, but also in the case of those, say, targeting Dalits or targeting other communities. What we have found is that ultimately the perpetrators go unpunished. There seems to be an sort of a culture of impunity, and this as a phenomena in studies of violence has not been attended to. So this chapter tries to examine how this impunity is produced through various different ways in which official documents are, you know, presented, read in different ways, or how, for example, FIRs are delayed, or there are unnamed of FIRs against unknown people, so that no one is held responsible. So there are different mechanisms through which this impunity is produced, and the chapter looks and examines that. We have a chapter on titled Mosque as Juristic Person. Here we are talking about a mosque called Shahid Ganj Mosque in Lahore in colonial India. But this is also an interesting case to understand how the ideology of this and the priorities of the state have changed over a period of time when faced with these kinds of disputes involving different communities. In the case of the Shahid Ganj Mosque, the interesting case was that it was during the Maharaja Ranjit Singh's regime that this Shahid Ganj mosque area came under the control of the Sikhs, who converted it into a gurudwara. When the colonial government established itself, the Muslim organizations now petitioned the government saying that while this had been annexed from them, encroached from them, and should be returned to them. So there was a whole legal battle which went along, and ultimately, the colonial state maintained the status quo. It did not want to enter into open up Pandora's box because similar kinds of multiple disputes were all around. And what it prioritized was the question of public order. Now, this priority of the state shifted significantly if we compare it with the judgment of, say, uh, uh, post independence on such questions of interreligious dispute, uh, where very often the state has sided with the majoritarian, uh, you know, impulses, and that was very evident in the Ayodhya judgment too. Finally, there is a chapter called Law of Exception, Caste, Conversion, and Anxieties of Nationhood. This looks into the question of Dalits amongst Muslims and Christians and how they have been denied the status of scheduled caste. Now, you would probably might be aware that the SC status is, you know, actually qualified by religion. That there is a presidential order of 1950, clause 3 of which says that the scheduled caste status can be extended only to untouchable communities belonging to the Hindu community. It over the years it made two exceptions. It included the six in 1956. So the caste groups which are similar to the untouchable caste amongst Hindus were extended this facility. Those who were Sikhs, they were extended this facility. Broadly, they are called Mazhabi Sikhs. And in 1990, the VP Singh government considered to the demands of the neo-Buddhists and accepted them in the scheduled caste category. But from 1950 onwards, there have been innumerable court cases as well as campaigns, etc., by those scheduled caste communities who have converted into Christianity or Islam, that they should also be accorded the SC status, because even if they had converted to different religion, their profession remained the same, their status remained the same more or less in the wider society. So a bhangi continued to be treated as a bhangi, a scavenger. So in that sense, they should be accorded the SC status. However, that continues to be denied even today. And there is a whole and the chapters looks into the questions as to what are those different stakeholders and how the court too comes to be implicated in this process of denying the SC status to the Dalits among Muslims and Christians. In fact, it is interesting that the Supreme Court, for example, has allowed those groups who many generations ago had converted out of Hinduism, say into Christianity. So from Hinduism, many generations ago, they converted into Christianity. But then later on, someone in the present generations claimed that he wishes to return back to Hinduism and he should now be given the SC status. The court, interestingly, has allowed that. It has argued that the period in which the person or the community which had moved out of Hinduism and into Christianity, that period was a period of eclipse. So there is a doctrine of eclipse, interestingly, that during this period they were not into Hinduism, their caste status was eclipsed. But once they have returned to Hinduism, they can be accorded the SC status because it can be revived now. Their caste status can be revived now. That actually makes, if you know about this political slogan called Ghar Wapsi, the courts actually, in some sense, are facilitating Ghar Wapsi by denying those who are leaving those untouchables in Hinduism who wish to leave Hinduism, so they are to be denied their SC status. But those who want to come back into it are reaccorded the same status. So this becomes actually a sort of an allurement to be returning back to the fold. So these are the various different contexts in which this book comes to study and tries to understand how the state and its practices have emerged vis-a-vis broadly, you know margin in some sense, and here in this case Muslims as a specific group. Now some of you might have read the excerpts which came out in Wire. I think the Quint also is planning to bring out the excerpts soon, but because of the elections they are not able to find space. The Wire excerpt of the book takes it out from the introduction, but it actually is wrongly titled. It says that how the idea of India has changed or something like that. In fact, in the book, what I argue is that while there is a lot of talk about this whole thing about idea of India, and there are civil liberty groups, there are liberal scholars, etc., who say and who argue that pluralism was something intrinsic to this idea of India, that diversity was part of the imagination of Indian nationhood, as Sunil Khilnani calls in his book, uh, that this diversity was somewhat similar, or is somewhat similar to a dhoti with multiple folds. So all these different kinds of cultural practices, etc., coexist, cohabit, probably in certain kind of peace and a very extremely tolerant situation. And this tolerant, beautiful, romantic world of diverse communities and plural discourses came to be ruptured because of the coming of this new regime. So there is a whole thing about the glorification of a past. And very often, some of these liberal scholars would also extend this argument further to say that this idea of plurality is actually intrinsic to the Indian civilizational discourse, to Hinduism. Like someone like Shashi Tharoor in his book Why I Am a Hindu argues that this is this whole idea of a tolerant Hindu, and it is something intrinsic to the idea of Indian nation, and draws it from certain slokas of Rig Veda. I have no objection to it. Indeed, India has had diverse cultural practices which have existed side by side, sometimes in conflict with each other, many times in coexistence. But my problem is this whole romanticization of the past, which leaves us with some very pressing questions. If this idea of plurality was so intrinsic to the Indian culture, to the Indian, civilizational idea, to the very Indian personality itself, then how did it happen that it collapsed in no time? Why do we see such triumphant nationalism all across? Why there is such this kind of aggressive monochromatic nationalism, aggressive nationalist discourse, which actually rests on predominant majoritarian framework, and how has it come to succeed? That success can easily be noticed. I'm not looking just at from 2014 onwards, but we can go back to decade or two earlier too, when they were very evident that these kinds of forces were gaining ground. So when we romanticize this past of idea of India, etc., we tend to forget the historical connection between what we are facing today and the past. So I wish to argue that even in the past too, we need to look at those kinds of notions which emphasize on plurality, which celebrate plurality, but miss out on the fact that that plurality also contained within itself a notion of hierarchy. Plurality, of course, was there, but that plurality of cultures also placed cultures, statuses into a certain kind of a hierarchy, where some were preferred, where others not. And from that onwards, we can look and see and examine how certain ideas of prevailing times, our times, how these kinds of discourses of triumphalism have had their roots in the past. In fact, in the very cultural makeup uh, of India, we can say India, that is Bharat. Excuse me. So, the book, particularly the introduction, which binds all these different chapters together, I just want to let you know that by training, I'm a political sociologist. And as part of political sociology, what you examine is this interaction between the state and the citizenry, or sections of citizenry, you may say. At the center of this uh, interaction is the idea of power and power relationships. How is power? Who gets what, when, and how? And therefore, we look also at society in terms of its segments, in terms of how this power distribution is, skewed in some sense. Uh, as we examine the theories of the Indian state, and we have had significant contributions in the past, say by Kaviraj, by Partha Chatterjee too, or there are many others of Marxian orientation who have tried to argue along using the class analysis framework to understand the state. Uh, if we look at the Nehruvian state and its theorization, there is a whole hagiography around it. That how, say, for example, Kaviraj would also argue about passive revolution, about how the state became the, modernizer par excellence. It again gives this whole notion about this. There is a society which is extremely bound by various kinds of hierarchies, primordial identities, caste, religion, etc., and conflicts amongst them, whereas there is a state which is neutral, which is beyond that, which is interested in actually transforming the social reality, this kind of a social reality, into a sort of a more harmonious one. This kind of a framework ignores the fact that the state all through has also had is also a reflection of the predominant forces within the society. So those who are the dominant classes also have, hold the steering wheel of power, and thus use that steering wheel of state power, and use that in reinforcing, in fact expanding their own influence. And therefore I've come to argue that one of the, you know one may say that the state ultimately succeeded, that grew huge legitimacy because it uh, you know emerged following the national movement, anti-colonial movement. uh, but at the same time, we see, if you examine it closely, that one of the reasons for its success also has been its multivocality. That the state, from its early days, from the beginning itself as an institution, has you know spoken in multiple voices, often in contradictory to each other. So while the constitution promised socialism as one of the ideals, or the way in which our economy was to be organized, it also flirted to a certain extent with state capitalism, the monopoly capitalism at the same time. If it emphasized on, secularism and secularization, and later on included secularism as a cardinal principle in the constitution itself, but at the same time, on various occasions, right from the beginning of the inauguration of the Somnath temple to today, the inauguration of the Ram temple, we see that how, in practice, the state has rarely been able to uphold the principle. So this multivocality of the state, and trying to understand how it promises different things to different sections of population, but largely it remains a sort of a, uh, a illusion, creates hopes, but ultimately delivers to those who are controlling its steering wheels. Pranab Bardhan had an interesting concept called compromise of power, where he argues that how state in India, rather than playing a neutral or a transforming role, where it could have ensured, you know, as a role, playing a role of transforming the society, where it could have ensured equality, it could have included freedom to everyone, it could have ensured that there was no huge income disparity. Nowadays there is talk about all this inheritance tax, etc., but these are all lip services. Ultimately it creates a certain kind of a, illusion, which make people hopeful about it. They restore their faith in the state. But when it comes to the implementation, we see that same inequalities are reproduced. In fact, conditions are created that further, uh, uh, you know, deprivations are allowed. I'll give you an example. If equality is one of the cardinal principles, but the same state from its beginning itself has allowed multiple education systems, which has actually created different kinds of classes within the society. You know, there are those who go to the regular government schools. There are hierarchy of kinds of government schools as well, and then there are kinds of schools in the privately owned schools, and these are all uh, you know places through which this whole thing about class is constructed, rebuilt, and reinforced. Similarly, we see in its economic policies too. Post 1991 onwards, of course, it has opened the gates altogether, and allowed capital to succeed entirely without putting a protection towards to the labor or the laboring populations. And now we have again an interesting debate during the elections taking place, which is centered around this whole idea about income distribution. In fact, now it is seen as a sort of a accusation. I don't understand why the Congress, for instance, has become so defensive on question of inheritance tax or on question of distribution. Does the state today claim to abandon the idea of socialism altogether? If that is the case, it should say so. It should argue that it is a redundant idea and therefore we are giving it up. But it is not so. It would like to keep the hopes of the laboring populations alive and thus retain those provisions without doing while doing something entirely opposite. So similarly, we see on many counts too a similar kind of a duality in the state practice, which is very evident. I use the concept of everyday state. This is an anthropological idea of the state which looks and understands state not as a sort of a earlier kind of a European theories of state which emphasized on state as a you know leviathan, as a huge institution which is well coordinated with for example, sociologist Weber would emphasize on bureaucracy and how bureaucracy is a well coordinated system with very defined rules, regulations, and hierarchy of offices, clear separation between office and home, and whole structure of it. It tries to present state as a sort of an instrument which is uh, completely cut above the society and what happens within the society. But uh, you know, the anthropological construction of the state, particularly this whole concept of everyday state, examines the state in terms of its everyday practices. It sees state not necessarily as a well coordinated, interacted system, but as something which has its own tensions, contradictions, uh, from a village postman to a high-ranking bureaucrat, are all part of the state, but they all have different kinds of roles and functions and class origins, etc. So there is a possibility of contradictions within the state too, as this anthropological idea of the state, everyday state, would be interested in studying. But more importantly, it tries to understand the state in terms of its, in terms of the way in which people have come to experience it. You know, and here we see that different sections of the population see the state entirely differently. The poor experience the state. Say, for example, the state is also a government hospital. The poor experiences entirely differently as compared to those who come from affluent classes. They're treated differently. There are different kinds of provisions for them, whereas the poor may be ridiculed and dehumanized. So, this idea of everyday state is interesting in the sense that it helps you in understanding the practice and trying to also see to what extent the claim which is formally made on behalf of the state and the way in which it actually performs on the ground. With this as a framework, I've also tried to then understand what I was mentioning earlier, the whole question of impunity. Impunity in everyday world, uh, how does it work? What are the different kinds of mechanisms involved? Uh, and how is it viewed by people who are sufferers of violence? During my field work in a village called Lakshmanpur Bathe in Bihar, I could see that the people experience the state in different ways. In 1997, some 58-59 Dalits were massacred by the private army of the upper caste landlords called Ranveer Sena. Those who were killed belonged to different castes, but largely scheduled castes amongst them. Some of them were also most backward caste groups. In terms of the classes, they counted amongst the poorest. There was no history of violence in that period, in that village, and most probably these killers came from neighboring villages, etc. However, whatever could be the reason for the violence or the massacre, those who were arrested by the police and prosecuted were eventually, freed by the High Court, most of them. And when I visited, the judgment had come out recently, and there were the two sections of the population within the village. The Dalits lived on the outskirts of the village, the Bhumiyar Tola was inside, and the difference was very stark, very clear. The two saw the whole concept of freedom, concept of justice, whole thing about impunity, completely different. For the upper caste, the state was had certain kind of instrumental rationality, that it was universal in delivering justice, that it upheld the highest echelons of the procedure, etc. And as a result of which, those who were incarcerated for the massacre, sorry, were released. But when I visited this Dalit Tola, there was a completely different reading of this same judgment. For them, the state, for them, it was all expected that even if they participated in the judicial process, they went as witnesses, etc. They took a risk of their life because the witnesses could also have been eliminated. However, they said that when they went to the court, deposed, etc., they were aware about what the outcome would be. They were aware because they knew that there's kind of resources which were required to elicit a favorable judgment. They did not have command over that. And that's therefore odds were against them. They still tried to pursue the course of justice. However, now their understanding of state was entirely different. They saw the state not as a, you know, as a great modernizer, as a great transformer, as a, one which has introduced passive revolution, etc., which said Sudipta Kaviraj would say. But in fact, they viewed the state in terms of a partisan state, a state which essentially was under the control of the upper caste, of the dominant people. And for the poor, there was, it did not stood by their side. So, based on these ideas, I have to try to understand the situation of the most ordinary Muslims. These chapters do not actually see the Muslim in terms of, as I said in the beginning, as a homogeneous category, but in fact, it tries to understand Muslim of the most vulnerable kind and how they have faced the state in all through. Those who are interested in understanding that method, etc., I rely on this is a historical sociology approach. I rely on documents majorly. These are documents which I have in one of my article. Uh, I have argued that these are documents of power. They are documents of power because these are officially produced documents, unlike those personal letters, etc. And these official documents with one stroke of pen can make lives or destroy them. The clear example today is of NRC, the National Register of Citizens, which was when it was published in 2019, ensured that 1.9 million people, 19 lakh people, were rendered without citizenship. There was celebration in Assam's, uh, you know, certain parts of Assam, which was dominated by the Assamese people, whereas there was picture, some sort of a gloom in areas which were largely inhabited by the Bengali speaking population in Assam. So the same document was received in different ways. The documents, as it is argued, have a life of their own. They are not inanimate beings as such. So they are producers. They are those who they're produced in certain kind of power-led settings. The NRC is again an example. In this, you know, book, I have relied on some very key significant documents such as the FIRs filed after violence. I've relied on the report of inquiry commissions. I've relied on a document such as NRC, which is such a significant one. I've tried to understand the process through which it has been produced and how partisan that process itself was. Sorry. I've also tried to, examine legal documents, as in the case of the chapter on cow slaughter, as well as the chapter on the mosque as a juristic person. So this is the framework through which I have tried to study the certain specific context for the interaction between the state and a segment of society, particularly certain Muslim communities. Well, thank you. And now I'll pass it on to Arco and follow as he instructs me. Thank you.
Uh, yes, thank you so much, sir. I will now open the floor for questions. As I have said, please pose your questions in the chat box, whoever is remaining. So before I read the question which is given, please allow me, sir, to ask two questions myself. So thank you so much for this talk. My first question is that you're talking about this constant invocation of some sort of past which was plural, as opposed to, you know, the current regime ruining that plurality. And that I found very interesting, because I share the same opinion that these constant invocations may render us a little less self-reflexive about how plural actually that plurality was. So I was wondering whether the same kind of discourse on this Indian state having allowed such a plurality once, the Indian nation, so as to speak, if that applies to invocations of civilization as well. For example, Rabindranath Thakur, when he's arguing against nationalism, talks about civilization in itself. So I was thinking whether or not civilization, which has its own, very dangerous implications, also qualifies in this kind of notion of invocation and, a loss of self reflexibility. And second of all, my other question would be that you talk about this thing called the everyday state. So us who we've grown up under a relatively European structure of academia, we would relate to state as being separate from government, as being some sort of abstraction which we are all a part of. But it seems for people, of course, the subjective experiences that you talk about, there is this sense of the state being the other, as opposed to those people. And that seems that can be an abstraction, but also there's a certain materiality to how that other is being portrayed. So how would you elaborate on that? These are my two questions.
Thank you, Arco. You actually got the gist of the argument. The first question about plurality, and as I during my presentation also I tried to suggest that this whole thing about plurality also, I have no as such quarrel with it. There is a huge diversity in India, but at the same time, when we see it as a value, then we need to also examine what are whether we are trying to, you know, the term I use, romanticize it in some sense. And in the process, we are ignoring the fact that there were problems deep within too. One of the, of course, was the question of hierarchy. The other was a question of also that there was a certain kind of an idea of domination. So this whole concept of plurality, uh, as it is, or the idea of tolerance, uh, needs to be therefore seriously examined, because otherwise we will left with a, in certain kind of a, vacuum to understand how have things turned to this situation when our plurality was so deep rooted that it was central to our cultural makeup, to our personality itself. Then how did it collapse in no time? Uh, so, therefore, with a sort of a self reflexivity, we need to go deeper and try to understand the connections between what we are facing today and how is it connected to the past. And then, if you reopen the whole nationalist discourse around the time of the partition, or even during the nationalist movement itself, there are immense problems. One of the problems, of course, which Ambedkar raised about caste domination, but there were also other kinds of problems which people of different nationalities were trying to raise. Although in the predominant anti-colonial mood, it remained suppressed. However, it emerged again during the constitution-making exercise. Many of these ideas, for example, about cost slaughter, about say this whole thing about uniform civil code. When we're talking about plurality, we also have this whole concept of uniform civil code sitting in our directive principles. How did it come in? Then so those are the things which we need to see and examine and find where it went wrong. You're right, Arco. We have to take the whole notion of civilization with a pinch of salt. uh, Civilizational discourse also very often moves into that direction. uh, Interestingly, it was pressures of these kinds that led to the Nehru government to institute a commission called Sanskrit Commission. Very few people are aware of it. This Sanskrit Commission was given its terms of reference was to examine whether Sanskrit can be made the official language of India. It had some of the Sanskrit scholars as well as nationalist leaders as its members, and the Sanskrit Commission submitted its report where it forcefully argued that how Sanskrit was the mother of all languages in India, and therefore it is the only language which deserves to be the national language of India. This is a sort of a problem which civilizational discourse also may bring in. This whole notion about civilizational as a greater entity, as one which subsumes every other culture, uh, and uh, and therefore we ending up with many kinds of impractical kinds of ideas like Sanskrit. Making Sanskrit as an impractical, it was an entirely impractical idea, and that is one of the reasons why the Nehru's government did not go further on it. uh, the second question about the state and how we the state as an abstraction, uh, you know it's not that you know those who see the state differently. I'm particularly talking about those on the margins who experience state differently, more in its violent form. Blomhamson makes this separation that there is in the cultural constitution of the state, how people experience it. There are two views of it. One is the sublime, and the other is the profane. The profane is more regular when they experience violence, when the policeman comes and uh, you know uh, pushes the vendor away, or when slum dwellers are frequently incarcerated, all kinds of such experiences of the state. Whereas the sublime one is where it uphold the state functionaries uphold the constitutional promise, etc. But that is, according to Blomhansen, rare in terms of the experience of the poor and the downtrodden and those on the margins. So they do not see state completely in terms of abstraction, but they actually see it in terms of its partisan nature, uh, and and as an everyday experience. So it actually affects their life, their work, their livelihood, but they at the same time will not see necessarily as one which is away from them, which is sits above the rest of the society, uh, or so. Okay. Uh, Next question.
Yes, I'll show the question here. It's a bit long. Can you read?
Yeah, I can, but it will take some a minute or two.
Shall I read it out for the audience? Let me do so.
Please do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so Mihir Seth is speaking. Thank you so much for your talk, Professor. The book sounds most intriguing. I will definitely read it sometime in the near future. I have two questions of sorts. Firstly, I would like to know your opinion on the question of the minority of Muslim leaders in the Hindu nationalist right. How does one square the notion of being marginalized by the same forces one is serving? And what is the currency of this leadership in the political imagination of Indian Muslim communities? Just,
There is one more. Secondly, is also there. So
yeah.
should I first answer the?
Yeah, you can first answer this. And
No,
then
no, you go ahead. Let me. Maybe the two questions are connected. So let's see. Is there more to it?
I, uh, I'm trying to figure. Sir, please go ahead and answer the first one. I'm figuring out.
Okay. Okay. Well, as I told you earlier itself, that I do not see Muslims as a homogeneous community. So there are kinds and kinds of groups within Muslims, and there are kinds of interests amongst within Muslims too. There are also those who would like to build, who are of the opinion to build bridges with the oppressor itself. This has happened in all societies. It's not specific to Muslims. But the extent to which they have any kind of a legitimacy within amongst the Muslims, particularly those Muslims who are suffering on account of the everyday violence, etc., which they face, it is very evident that they do not enjoy much legitimacy. Uh, and as a result, even the Hindu nationalists now have reduced them to be spokespersons rather than, actually going to the field as mobilizers, because that doesn't seem to be working much. Uh, Nevertheless, as I said, there are also people who could be of the opinion that, well, the Hindu nationalist right too has something for them, and one should engage with that. Those opinions have existed, but those experiences, those kinds of opinions, do not match with the experience of the community. And as long as that contradiction exists, the legitimacy of these kinds of leaders will always be, you know doubtful. Okay.
Yeah, so secondly, it's unfortunately not showing here. Secondly, I would like to know how you have seen the increasing ghettoization of Muslim communities in India and the intersections between being marginalized in urban spaces and the ability to be subjected to mass violence.
Ghettoization, I feel, is also at times related to violence itself. And many places, although, I too have argued, and there's a book by Jaffer, edited volume by Jaffer on Muslims in Indian cities, where one of the papers with which I agree, of course, is on Jamia Nagar of Delhi, which is also considered to be a ghetto of some sort, where he comes to argue that, at least this was written before Delhi also faced anti-Muslim violence in 2020, 920 or so. But this was written much earlier, and Delhi, that ways for many years had not faced anything like that. And still, we see the emergence of some certain such kinds of communities, such kind of neighborhoods, which were community specific. So that chapter argued that there is also a concept of what is called apna mahal, so our kind of environment, which is constituted of not just uh, the fact that a person of same religious persuasion is living next to me, but also various kinds of institutions which emerge in the process. you know so there could be a mosque, which is also a requirement for those who are religious, and large majority of Indian population are religious, for the fact. uh, the mixed locality in which I live, it's hardly mixed. I live in a DDA society, where I would, among the 1,500 flats which are here, there might be three or four of those of Muslim sounding names. There's a big temple which has emerged, uh, not allowed by DDA. DDA actually comes and demolishes anything which is encroached, but this has been there and expanding every year. Now, the temple priest, who doesn't own any flat within the complex, has built his own flat within the temple. He actually enjoys better facilities than the rest of those who are the owners. Uh, so, so that is how you see this whole thing about ghettoization extremely complex, uh, and it is two-way or multiple way process. uh, there are mixed localities which have emerged, but those mixed localities are not, sufficiently, you know, provided with provisions which different cultural communities might require. Uh, they're not really mixed, but they are predominantly majoritarian in that sense, and they therefore also do not, allow a certain kind of a mixing to take place. Uh, the thing about ghettoization also produces violence. Violence also produces ghettoization is also evident from, say, a place like Gujarat, where again, it's so difficult to for even a Muslim middle class person, professional, to get a house even of his own in a locality of Gujarati Hindus, and they're largely pushed to the old city of you know Ahmedabad. So that is how we can see that these things do take place. Of course, in any ideal situation, one would not endorse ghettoization. One would rather try to argue that co-shared spaces are far more important because they also produce understanding about each other. Uh, However, this is a reality as we face, as we see in our times.
Yeah, thank you. The next question, I'll show it right here. Thank you, Professor. This is by Srijan Roy. Thank you, Professor, for such a wonderful and informative talk. What is your opinion on the implications of the implementation of the UCC, which the current dispensation has made it a point in the current election rhetoric to use as a political legal weapon against the Muslims to further marginalize them, and its broader consequences on the community, especially women?
Yeah. See, the UCC, of course, was has had two kinds of you know frameworks from which it has come into being. One was, of course, the feminist and those who were trying to argue that how various different community specific laws, the Muslim personal law, the Hindu personal law, or the Christian personal law, or whatever, that they are not gender just, that they rely on past traditions, etc., where women, of course, were, uh, s- you know, in some ways or the other, were to suffer, and hence there needs to be a reformed civil code which is more gender just, And at one point of time, the feminist movement in India upheld the idea of the UCC. So this came from a modernist frame. The other one is this triumphalist frame from which this whole thing about UCC is being pushed. And the question, when you ask, the answer lies within itself. That is actually being used as a political legal weapon, basically to, you know, further, stigmatize Muslims as those who are, fanatics, etc. Uh, Now there is, of course, a resistance from within from Muslims too to the idea of the UCC. Uh, there are various reasons for which there is a religious lobby, which of course wishes to live its life in accordance with what is called the provisions of the of religious code. But besides that, implement a UCC could be effectively implemented if it is the need. It could be effectively implemented only when the state has been able to establish a certain kind of a legitimacy among all communities, you know, including those who are the minorities. As of now, it looks like a weapon uh, being used uh, to target minority cultural practices. They fear that in such a situation, they will lose their identity altogether. So in such a, you know polarized situation, an informed debate on UCC is virtually impossible. It is a situation which actually allows the conservative on both sides to succeed, you know, or else as an informed debate on reform, etc., could have been initiated. There have been, changes within the religious code amongst Muslims in different parts of the world, but those were, you know, through a gradual process, through a longer debate and discussion, and still there were, of course, conflicts, but they were, in an entirely different atmosphere. The state, if it is honest about it, should initiate those debates and then try to push anything further.
So that is all the questions I think we have for now. Thank you so
Okay.
much, Professor Fazal, for being here with us and giving us this enlightening talk. I'm going to end the stream. I would request Professor to stay for a little longer. Thank you so much for watching this stream. We have been Voyages. Good night.
Bye bye.